Thanks very much. Now our next speaker is a Scotsman, Edinburgh, and by the age he was 15 or so he was heavily involved around the local airport, cleaning aeroplanes and refuelling and taxiing them up and down and so on. And he had his pilot's licence before he had his driver's licence. Then he worked as a management trainee for the House of Fraser, which was a department store chain. And then he went to Harrods. And then he came out to Australia in 1969 and spent some time with MMA as a traffic officer in Derby. Then he joined IBM and later became the business manager. So he's a very keen member of the volunteer team at the Aviation Museum, and I've got great pleasure in calling on Ian Howell.
First of all, my thanks to the two Brians for their superb efforts which allow us to bring you these presentations. I'm one of approximately 200 volunteers who help run the Aviation Museum, Bullcreek. Now that the Catalina has arrived at the museum, I thought it would be timely to give you a presentation on the general history of the aircraft and its role in World War II. In particular, I would like to focus on what makes the Catalina special to Western Australia and the part that it played in our aviation heritage. When I first discussed with Brian the possibility of presenting an update on the museum, he suggested I give a 10-minute mini-talk. One thing led to another, and there seemed to be a lot of interest in the Catalina, so we agreed to hold over the talk on the museum and just focus on the Catalina. Our museum is a wholly owned asset of the Air Force Association. The museum is run as a private and independent organisation without any government funding. It operates as a not-for-profit and is self-funded from admittance fees, sales in the shop, and support from the Air Force Association. Anything you can do to help us would be much appreciated. We are always looking for new volunteers. When visitors arrive at the museum, the first thing they receive after a good welcome is a program. The opening statement on the front of our cover of our program describes our mission at the museum as preserving and presenting our aviation heritage. I hope this presentation will give you some idea of the sort of history which we would like to preserve and maintain for future generations. When the first discussions were held with the Catalina Foundation late last year regarding the possibility of displaying the Catalina at the museum, the reaction from our volunteers was one of immense enthusiasm. To be able to display the Catalina with our Lancaster, the C-47 and other fine aircraft will considerably enhance the museum's opportunity to attract new visitors. The volunteers at the museum recognize that we all owe a great debt of gratitude to the Catalina Foundation and the work they have done in bringing the Catalina to WA. We hope that their members will continue to be involved with the museum for a long time to come. This picture of the Catalina was taken before it left the US and gives you a pretty good idea of what it will look like when it is finally reassembled in the museum. We are hoping that contracts between the WA Museum, acting for the government, and the Foundation will be signed this week, and that this will allow the Foundation in turn to sign an agreement for display accommodation with the museum. All being well, it is hoped that we can put the Catalina on display to the public sometime in March. We do have a representative, that is the gentleman who helped rebuild the Catalina, coming out next week, so we are certainly hoping that all will go well. And it is a very good indication of the future of the aircraft that is currently parked outside the museum. The aircraft is a consolidated PBY 5A Catalina, build number 46624, construction number 1988. The PB stood for patrol boat and the Y was the manufacturer's code. The Catalina arrived in WA on the 14th of September 2001 and has been stored at the Midland Railway workshop sheds for the last 4 years. The Foundation's plans were to locate the Catalina in a purpose-built memorial building, but unfortunately funds could not be raised. This picture was taken in the Midland storage shed. Of particular interest is the bombardier's window in the bow. The vast majority of PBY 5s and 5A amphibians had rectangular windows, whereas the PBY 6A, the later model, had a triangular one. However, a small number of late production 5As built in New Orleans had the triangular window, which you can clearly see in this photo. The Catalina was delivered to the museum on the 4th of January this year. 3 shipping containers held the wings, engines, tailplane, and other parts accompanying the fuselage. It is all currently stored outside the museum behind the security fence. Here we have a happy Ivan Pierce standing beside the Catalina on its arrival. To make room for the Catalina, the Junkers floatplane replica will be removed and stored. I can confirm to you that as of last night, the Junkers has been removed. The Catalina has a wingspan of 104 feet, that is 31.7 meters, and as a result, many of the museum exhibits will need to be moved. The silver crop-spraying tiger moth has already been removed. The blue crop-spraying wacket has also been dismantled and is ready for removal and storage. This aircraft may be used for a possible swap with Point Cook for a North American Sabre jet later in the year. And now some general production details on the Catalina. Initial production commenced in 1936, and all early models were flying boats. In November 1939, Consolidated flew the first of its amphibian model, the PBY-5A. The model changes from PBY-1 through to PBY-5 mostly had to do with some changes to the tail, and then models 3, 4, and 5 were upgrades with their ever more powerful engines. The PBY-5A amphibian was produced from October 41 until 1945, and this model included hydraulically actuated retractable tricycle landing gear and a tail gun position. The bow single gun position was replaced with a bow eyeball turret equipped with twin .3 machine guns plus improved armor and self-sealing tanks. Some more on the general history. Here we have an RAAF Catalina in its World War II color scheme. Now just a little on the general history. The Catalina saw the widest service and greatest production of any flying boat in the world. In excess of 4,000 PBYs or licensed variants were constructed in the United States, Canada, and the Soviet Union between 1936 and 1945. This is more than any other flying boat in history. The Russians called their model of the Catalina the GST. In 1940, the Boeing Canada factory in Vancouver was licensed to build the PBY from parts made by Consolidated. These Canadian aircraft were named Cansos. Today, only about 30 Catalinas remain airworthy in the world. There are approximately another 100 on display in museums or in storage, waiting for rebuild or future display. In the ANZ region, we are fortunate to have 2 airworthy Catalinas. In Australia, the Hires Group in Sydney operate a PBY-6A, registered Bravo Zulu, and New Zealand also has an airworthy Catalina, Bravo Yankee. Catalinas saw extensive use in air forces around the world with over 20 nations. The Consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat flew more hours on combat patrol than any other American warplane, and the PBY was the first US aircraft produced in quantity to carry radar. Catalinas performed a variety of essential duties, including long-range reconnaissance, anti-submarine patrols, convoy escort work, search and rescue missions, and torpedo bombing attacks. It was in this latter function that the Catalina established its greatest legacy by sinking more enemy shipping than any other single type of aircraft during World War II. Because of their worldwide popularity, there was scarcely a maritime battle in World War II in which they were not involved. The PBY did have its vulnerabilities. It was slow, with a maximum speed of only 179 miles an hour, and the cruise was only 125 miles an hour. It carried no crew armor protection or self-sealing tanks, and as a result was highly vulnerable to anti-aircraft attack or attack from other aircraft. However, it was these weaknesses, together with the development of effective radar and the Japanese reliance on night transport, which led to the creation of the US Navy Black Cat squadrons and to their great success in the night attack anti-shipping rule. Here we have a picture of an RAF Catalina on patrol. By 1939, the US Navy was considering phasing the Catalina out. However, in July 39, the RAF tested the Catalina and was so impressed with its performance that they placed an immediate order for 50 aircraft. The RAF decided to adopt the name Catalina, which had been used by the Consolidated Commercial Sales Department prior to the first British order. The RAF went on to order 700 aircraft, and these were used by 9 squadrons at home with Coastal Command and 12 squadrons based overseas. RAF Catalinas could be fitted with lee lights, a type of searchlight to assist with anti-submarine attacks, and RAF Catalinas are credited with destroying 40 U-boats. The RAF aircraft were very similar to US Navy PBYs and differed in the main only in the armament carried. In the Atlantic, it was a Catalina that sighted the German battleship Bismarck in 1941, and this sight, of course, led to its sinking. As part of British RAF orders, 12 Catalinas were allocated to BOAC. 7 of these aircraft were used on the Poole to Lagos West African service. This service helped to keep the airmail route from England to Australia open after the Mediterranean route was closed. The other 5 ex-RAF Catalinas for BOAC were offered to Qantas to commence the Perth to Ceylon service, and I'll cover this in a little bit more detail later. The Catalina was a superb maritime patrol aircraft with its long range of 2,500 miles or over 4,000 kilometers. It had a 30-hour plus endurance and a crew of 9. RAF Catalina operations in our region can be traced back to 205 Squadron based in Singapore, known as the Far East Flight. They received their first Catalina in April 1941. The Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia resulted in heavy losses and a forced strategic withdrawal to Australia. The squadron was reformed in July 42 at Kogala in Ceylon with 8 Catalinas. Anti-submarine patrols and air-sea rescue operations were maintained for the rest of the war. 205 maintained mooring and fueling facilities in the Cocos Islands, Christmas Island, Maldives, Seychelles, and Mauritius. Later, Royal Canadian Air Force 413 Squadron joined the RAF group in Ceylon. It was an RCAV 413 Catalina flown by Squadron Leader Burchell that spotted the Japanese fleet 350 miles southeast of Ceylon on the 4th of April 1942. Although Burchell was shot down, he did manage to radio the sighting. The warning proved vital. All naval and merchant ships were ordered to sail and disperse, and the following day the Japanese Navy struck with a force of 125 aircraft. Waiting for them was a force of only 36 Hurricanes and 6 Fleet Air Arm Ferry former fighters. 23 Japanese aircraft were shot down. 3 days later, the Japanese fleet attacked the naval base of Trincomalee. The newly installed radar spotted them, and they were met by 17 Hurricanes who shot down an additional 21 Japanese aircraft. 9 more Japanese aircraft were destroyed by ground fire. The Japanese attacks resulted in the losses of 2 Royal Navy cruisers, the carrier Hermes, and other ships, and substantially damaged the port facilities. The Japanese had not lost a single ship, but Vice Admiral Nagumo's carrier force had been seriously hurt and was sufficiently depleted to force the 3 of his 5 carriers to return to Japan for new crews and aircraft. There is little doubt that the Catalina sighting of the Japanese fleet was a major factor in the heavy Japanese losses. These losses meant that when Nagumo was challenged in the Coral Sea the following month, he only had 2 carriers with him, a fact which was vital in the successful outcome of the Battle of the Coral Sea. Interrogation of Japanese naval staff after the war disclosed that some of their most experienced pilots were lost in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Ceylon. Winston Churchill is reported to have said that Squadron Leader Burchell, flying his Catalina, saved Britain and the Allies from a major disaster. The early warning Ceylon received from Burchell's Catalina had eliminated the element of surprise. A month later, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, RAAF Catalinas from RAF mines were the first to spot the Japanese fleet approaching. On the 3rd of June 42, near Midway, A Catalina again, this time with the US Navy's VP-44 squadron, spotted the Japanese fleet steaming at high speed towards Midway Island. This sighting resulted in the US fleet launching a torpedo and dive bombing attack from the carriers Hornet, Enterprise and Yorktown, which resulted in a conclusive victory for the US Navy. This is a photo of an RAAF PBY-5A Catalina. Note the access ladder into the blister window. The first RAAF Catalinas were ferried across the Pacific by Qantas crews, and the first aircraft, A24-1, was accepted on the 5th of February 1941. The last RAAF Catalina being A24-386, and this was accepted on the 3rd of September 1945. In all, 168 Catalinas were delivered to the RAAF. The aircraft included Mark 1s and 2s, which were PBY-5 flying boats, Mark 3s, which were the 5A amphibians, and the high-tail radome-fitted Mark 4 and Mark 6. The RAAF took delivery of 46 5A amphibians, and the last Catalina departed service from the RAAF in 1952 from the Rathmines base, which had been the RAAF's main operational Catalina base for 12 years. This is a nice picture of the black Catalina in RAAF colors, which is currently flying in the eastern states, Bravo Zulu. The saga of the Catalina and its role as the RAAF's long-range strike and mine-laying force had its origins in Port Moresby in the early 1940s. 11th Squadron was re-equipped with the newly arrived Catalina from the US in March 1941, quickly followed by 20 Squadron. Although the name of the squadrons never changed from GR, that is General Reconnaissance, its role certainly did. When 6 aircraft were added to these squadrons, three aircraft from each squadron set out for the first bombing raid on Japanese positions, staging through Manus and Kavian, respectively, to attack the Japanese naval installation at Trap. After the introduction of mines in April 1943, the Catalina bombing effort was gradually phased out until 3 squadrons, including number 43 Squadron, were almost totally dedicated to mine laying, with great success. The Australian Black Cats became renowned as the RAAF's Catalina ranged out of Darwin and covered the whole of the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, and ever westwards as far as the Chinese coast, covering most enemy ports in the Southwest Pacific area. As the name implies, the RAAF Catalinas were painted black. The mine-laying missions were extremely hazardous. It was highly skilled work which required precision flying, and most ports were well defended. To place the mines well, a straight-in approach had to be made, only a few hundred feet above the water, and if anti-aircraft fire or fighters spoiled the run-in, another run was usually attempted at great risk. Other activities contained within the GR role of supply drop, maritime reconnaissance and air-sea rescue continued to be undertaken. This may be a picture of a high-tailed Mark IV Catalina. On one mission involving 27 Catalinas from several bases, the main harbor in Manila was mined to bottle up the Japanese fleet, pending MacArthur's invasion of Mindoro. This led to the retaking of Manila through the months of February to March 45. The damaged shipping blocked the harbor for 3 months. RAAF Catalina crews logged many hours in the air due to the nature of their long-distance operations, and many of the crews exceeded 2,000 flight hours by the end of the war. A little about the US Navy use now. This is a picture of a US Navy Catalina from VP-101 Squadron. By mid-1939, the US Navy, as I've mentioned, had written off the PBY as obsolete. But with the British declaration of war on Hitler's Germany in 1939, an order for 106 aircraft had been placed by Britain by the end of the year. The US Navy had a rethink about the qualities of the Catalina, and in December 1939 placed a further order for 400 aircraft. The name Catalina was eventually adopted by the US Navy in October 41. By December 1941, the US Navy had built up their strength to 23 PBY squadrons, with each squadron equipped with 12 aircraft. Later, US Navy wartime Catalina operations peaked at 29 Catalina squadrons, with others held in reserve for training. When the new US squadron numbering system was introduced in July 1939, all 21 of the US Navy patrol squadrons were renumbered. For example, Patrol Squadron 4, that is VP4, became Patrol Squadron 22, VP22. Patrol Wing 10 US Navy, Pat Wing 10, who we were to become familiar with as they eventually arrived down on the Swan River, was established at Naval Station Cabot in the Philippines in December 1940. During the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 41, VP-22 was based on Ford Island. 7 of their Catalinas were destroyed. In fact, all 33 Catalinas belonging to the 6 squadrons based on Oahu, Hawaii, were disabled or destroyed. As a result, VP-22 was allocated an additional 12 PBY-5s and moved to the Philippines in January 42. They were then assigned to Patrol Wing 10. Pat Wing 10 reallocated to Ambon on the 28th of December 41, and VP-21 and 26, which became VP-101 and 102, gradually withdrew south to Borneo, and in January 42 to Surabaya, Java, where the combined squadrons flew the remaining 12 Catalinas. 11 more Catalinas of VP-22 joined Pat Wing 10 on 11th January 42, and it was around this time that the Allies formed ABDA, that is the group made up of Australian, British, Dutch and American forces to help coordinate the Allied war effort. However, the Japanese were not to be stopped at this stage, and the Japanese bombing of Darwin on 19th February 42 left the harbour a shambles, and 3 more of Pat Wing 10's Catalinas were lost. Darwin was without early warning radar, and it was decided to send the Catalinas south to Broome, which was considered a reasonably safe port. On the morning of 3rd March 42, Japanese aircraft attacked Broome and destroyed 3 more of the US Navy's Catalinas. In addition, RAAF and Dutch flying boats were attacked and destroyed. Pat Wing 10 was now reduced to 3 Catalinas and moved further south to the Swan River, where they arrived on the 7th of March 42. Pat Wing 10 commenced operating as a unit on this day, with patrol squadrons 101, 102 and 22 operating from Pelican Point. They had 3 PBY Catalinas, 2 single-engine Kingfishers, and 2 single-engine Curtiss Scouts. Shortly afterwards, at the end of April 42, the US Army was still holding out at Corregidor in the Philippines. The US Navy launched a rescue mission, and 2 Catalinas departed from the Swan River base on the 27th of April. They flew from Perth to Darwin. At Darwin, daily bombing made refueling extremely risky. They then flew on to Ambon, Mindanao, and Corregidor near Manila. 1 Cat later took off with 25 passengers, and the other took 35 passengers, including 10 nurses. They returned with all of their occupants safely to Crawley on the 3rd of May 1942, which was really quite an incredible mission. The US Navy Catalinas also made a substantial contribution to the war effort in the Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese merchant fleet was resupplying their forces at night. The Catalina was equipped with radar and painted black for night operations. Surprise night bombing attacks on Japanese shipping were extremely successful. Catalinas also proved to be very effective in search and rescue missions. These were codenamed Dumbo missions. Small detachments, normally of 3 Catalinas, routinely orbited on standby near targeted combat areas. 1 detachment based in the Solomon Islands rescued 161 airmen between 1st January and 15th of August 1943. After the war, the PBY reverted to a peacetime role of maritime patrol and air-sea rescue, many being transferred to the Reserve and Coast Guard squadrons. The last of the US Navy's PBYs were retired in 1957. Here we have a Qantas Catalina Vega Star at the Netherlands jetty Swan River. After the fall of Singapore in February 42, all airmail services to Australia were terminated. Chairman of the Qantas board and co-founder Hudson Fysh entered discussions with BOAC in October 42 about reinstating the airmail service from Australia to UK. Fysh visited the UK, and it was agreed after long negotiations which lasted 4 months between the British Air Ministry, BOAC and Qantas, that Qantas would operate the service for an annual fee of £100. In May 1943, the first proving flight was operated from Ceylon to Perth. Several of these flights were then carried out as flight information was gradually built up. This is a Qantas Catalina Spiker Star number 5 in the fleet. Qantas operated 5 Catalinas from the Swan River during World War II. There were 2 PBY-5Bs, 2 5s, and a 2B-1. None of them were the amphibian type. They were all named after stars. The names of the aircraft were Altair Star, Vega Star, Regal Star, Antares Star, and Spiker Star. They had a large number painted on the tail from 1 to 5. They retained their RAAF camouflage scheme of dark sea grey and dark slate grey upper surfaces with duck egg blue undersurfaces, and they carried dual civil and military registrations. Under the cockpit window was written Qantas Empire Airways Limited. This is Qantas Antares Star number 4. As you can see, the facilities for maintenance were fairly basic. The Qantas Long Range Division had already successfully delivered 19 Catalinas across the Pacific from the US for the RAAF and had built up substantial operating experience with the aircraft. A Qantas proving flight was recorded as the first Indian Ocean airmail service on the 25th of June 1943. This was operated by Altair Star. It had taken Qantas only 16 months to restart the airmail service to the UK after the fall of Singapore. Managing Director Hudson Fish had always been convinced that the Catalina was the only aircraft which could do the job, and the service was at the time the longest scheduled airline route in the world. This service was vital and connected Australia with its major wartime allies. Initially there was only 1 flight per week, and the payload was restricted to 1,000 pounds, that is about 455 kilos. Not a huge payload for a 30-hour flight. Later the services were increased to twice a week, and flights continued on from Ceylon to Karachi to meet the BOAC flights from London. The aircraft had British registrations, and they were supplied under the American Lend-Lease arrangements. 2 weeks after the end of World War II, the US government brought the Lend-Lease contract to a close, and under the terms of the agreement, aircraft had to be paid for or destroyed. Sadly, on the 28th of November 1945, they were towed out to sea and destroyed in deep water off Rottnest Island. Spiker Star, the only Boeing-built Catalina in the fleet, was destroyed off the Sydney Heads in March 1946. The aircraft had flown 1.38 million miles, carried 648 passengers, most of whom were VIPs, 14,000 pounds of priority cargo, 113,000 pounds of airmail, and at the end of the service, the Qantas Western Operations Division closed. It would be another 6 years before a Qantas aircraft was again scheduled through the city of Perth. This is a picture of the certificate awarded to the few passengers that travelled on the service. The certificate was in recognition of travel on a service which usually took 30 hours and on which most passengers witnessed 2 sunrises, hence the double sunrise certificate. Qantas later acquired a total of 12 ex-RAAF Catalinas, which were purchased at disposal sales from 1947. These aircraft went on to provide excellent service from Sydney to Noumea, Fiji, Lord Howe Island, and also on internal services in PNG. They were all finally retired in August 1958. Catalina is painted in a World War II Dutch Navy colour scheme. It is operated today in the Netherlands as a warbird and flying tribute to the Dutch Naval Air Service. No story about the Catalina would be complete without mention of the operations of the MLD, or Marine Luchtvaartdienst. The MLD had 36 Catalinas in the Dutch East Indies. In addition, they also operated 34 3-engine Dornier Do 24 flying boats, not unlike the Catalinas in design. After heavy losses, they were forced to evacuate Java in March 1942 with only 9 remaining Catalinas. 4 battle-damaged PBY-3s. Catalinas were flown to Ceylon, where they formed the nucleus of a new squadron under RAF operational control. Other Dutch Catalinas made their escape to northwestern Australia during these last hectic days of the withdrawal. 5 of these Dutch Catalinas flew on to the RAAF base at Rathmines. But 4 Dutch Catalinas were not so fortunate. They had flown south along the WA coast to Broome and were caught on the surface and destroyed when the Japanese raided Broome on the 3rd of March 42. It was in this same raid that 6 Dutch Do-24 Dornier flying boats were also lost. In total, 8 Catalinas were lost on this devastating raid from the various air forces. The Dutch Catalinas at Rathmines were transferred to Ceylon in July 42 and departed Australia by Exmouth. The honour of making the first non-stop flight across the Indian Ocean from Australia to Ceylon goes to one of these Dutch Catalina crews. The Dutch then continued to pioneer Ceylon-Perth flights, 3 of which were made from December 42. Some of these flights were in support of the submarines, which were operating from Fremantle. Later, the Dutch Catalinas were formed into number 321 Squadron, which was within the 222 group of our RAAF. They were re-equipped with PBY 5As and operated from China Bay near the naval base of Trincomalee. This group would later be part of the island-hopping counter-offensive against Japanese forces. The New Zealand Air Force was also a big operator of the Catalina, with 56 aircraft which flew operations throughout the South Pacific, from Hobsonville and Fiji on maritime patrol and air-sea rescue work. And now finally a word on some famous survey flights. No presentation on the role of the Catalina in the Australian region would be complete without a mention of a couple of outstanding survey flights flown in the Catalina. The first Catalina to arrive in Australia was imported in 1938. It was a privately owned Model 28-2 and was leased by the Commonwealth Government from Dr. Richard Archbold of the American Museum of Natural History. Goober 2 was commanded by Captain P.G. Taylor on a survey flight across the Indian Ocean. It departed from Rose Bay on the 4th of June 39 via Port Hedland, Batavia, Cocos, Diego Garcia, Seychelles to Mombasa, East Africa. This is a total distance of about 10,800 kilometers. The purpose of the flight was to chart an alternative Empire air route. This was organized as a precaution against possible Japanese aggression and the loss of the airmail route through Singapore. As if one record-breaking survey flight wasn't enough for Captain Gordon Taylor, he also made the first flight from Australia to South America on the uncharted route from Sydney to Valparaiso, Chile. The aircraft was, once again, a Catalina and was named Frigate Bird 2. It left Rose Bay on the 13th of March 1951. 8 stops were made, the last being at Easter Island. The 13,600 kilometer flight was successful and helped to pioneer the route later for Qantas. And that is the end of my presentation. If you do have any questions, then I'd be very happy to take them, and thank you for listening.